We're here to launch the report of the Joint Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure Reform and Taoiseach and the Public Accounts Committee. I want to welcome you all to this launch of what is a very important report. At the outset, I want to thank the committee members of both committees and the Secretariat for their input into this report, for organising it and for presenting it here today. Brian Stanley, the Chairman of the PSC, is not with us. We wish him well. And the other member, I suppose not on the PSC now, but Deputy Mark McSharry had an input into the report itself. I'm joined by the Vice Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and I would ask you maybe if you wish to say a few words, and then we'll go to the members.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Firstly, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Public Accounts Committee who collaborated with the Finance Committee, who were the lead on this particular piece of work. And I think it was an important piece of work that followed on from a lot of public concern about the appointment of the Secretary-General of the Department of Health. I think it's a strength that the two committees came together, and I think that it's something that we should see happen again. The committee made 14 recommendations, all of which I anticipate will be fully absorbed and considered by the Minister of Public Enterprise and Reform, and not only considered, but I very much hope that they will be fully taken on board. The recommendations range across a number of concerns around and seek reform, enhanced levels of transparency, to the implementation of structured formal appointments process for both interim and permanent positions. It's important to emphasise from the outset that there was a deviation from the regular appointment process to top level appointments at the civil service in this particular case, a deviation that has real potential knock-on consequences in the way in which accounting officers are appointed and remunerated. There's no formal process, or there was no formal process or benchmarking process followed in relation to the interim appointment or for the 40% increase in salary for the permanent post. So it's not unreasonable to expect there's nothing other than transparency in relation to how such appointments are made. We require the highest standards in terms of public service recruitment. I mean, some of the things that jump out from the report, and I wasn't one of the members. There was Deputy Brian Stanley, Matt Carty, Jennifer McNeill and Verona Murphy were our nominees from the Public Accounts Committee, and Deputy Mark McSharry, as has been said, had an input as well. But the things that jump out from the report are the words like informality, ad hoc arrangements, lack of transparency, insufficient record keeping, no independent advice or rigorous benchmarking, the huge salary increase at a time when there was 1% increase under the Public Service Stability Agreement proposed, accountability or the absence of it. And as a general rule, a poor process leads to poor outcomes. And as I said, we should expect nothing less than the absolute best case or the best process so that we get best outcomes. And where we advertise a job, that people feel that job is actually available to be filled. And that was one of the questions. That was certainly something that the public were concerned about. I think power is the key, and that certainly this this was not an issue that was driven by the political system or our politicians. This was very much something that was an issue of serious public concern, and that is why the two committees came together and spent this time and produced, I think, a very good report, which I think is critical, but it's also constructive. And I would hope that not only will it be read, but as I say, it will be implemented. Thank you.
Very much. Any member wish to make a contribution? Sharon?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank you, Chair, and Brian Stanley for both your leadership in terms of allowing for both committees to come together to produce this really important report today. I think the issue of how public sector workers, how members of the civil service are appointed, how they are paid, how they are promoted, is really important in ensuring confidence of the public in our civil service, and particularly in the context that we have a public sector pay deal where the vast majority of public sector workers are getting a 1% pay increase this year and a 1% pay increase next year. And also when the details of this pay arrangement broke, we had the issue of student nurses working in our wards and not being paid at that time, or some student nurses. So the issue of confidence and transparency in how civil servants are paid and how they're promoted is really important. And it is not good enough that we've had an element of discretion with regards to how remuneration was decided, in this case, for the General Secretary of the Department of Health. So I want to very much welcome the report. I think as Deputy Murphy highlighted, there's a number of very constructive recommendations here, and I think that's the vital thing today. This is not to highlight just solely the problem, but to also put forward recommendations, and in particularly with regards to how TLAC is organised into the future, with regards to that independent and separate entity that looks at higher pay within the civil service. And of course we had a review of higher level pay within the civil service a number of years ago, but of course that was abandoned. So really important now that structures are put in place to ensure that we do not find ourselves in a situation, again, where we've been told by the government that they just decided on a figure for a particular civil servant. That's no longer good enough. And we very much hope that the government implements these recommendations here, because I think it's important to say we have members across every party and non-independents here today, I suppose, supporting this document. So they'll let the message go out that this needs to be recommended, because we won't tolerate an instance like this again. Gurmagut.
I suppose it's no harm just to reflect for a minute on how this came about. The public disquiet that arose because of the increase for a Secretary General in the Department of Health to the tune of 81,000 thereabouts. If you compare the increase and the salary, it is greater than some senior positions internationally, including WHO. Now, the arrangement whereby the interim Secretary General was appointed, I think, came under scrutiny in the course of our deliberations on this matter. And the final appointment process was also considered. Members were very critical of both the lack of process in both. And the committees then were brought together to look at all of the issues involved and why it happened the way that it did. And unfortunately, in the course of the work of the committee, many senior politicians and senior civil servants obstructed the course of the committee's hearings. We got very little cooperation from the Taoiseach. The Taoiseach recorded his lack of knowledge about anything to do with this. And the other partner in government, Minister Ryan, didn't engage with the committee at all. In fact, I don't think he even replied to the committee. When the matter was pursued and we invited Mr. Watt to the committee, he replied with a press release, which I think it's unbecoming of a civil servant in that senior position. We also discovered that TLOC is very much established in the department as part and parcel of the department. And the committee found that that shouldn't be the case, that TLAC should be reconfigured and that the members of TLAC should reflect qualifications in HR, in processes such as this, and in some legal areas. Now, there was no real process. We don't know where the idea came from to appoint an interim person to the position of Secretary General of the Department of Health. We don't know how those conversations started. We don't know who was central to those conversations. And then in the course of the process itself, while there was some international interest, it was found that out of all of those interviews, that the person holding the position of acting Secretary General was selected. Now, that process itself, from a political perspective, is unacceptable. It was also established during the course of the hearings that a lot of this was done verbally through the Cabinet. So there seems to have been no written memo to Cabinet, is what we were told. And the arrangement was a verbal arrangement. So those that are central to the decision making around this, as I said, in my opinion, obstructed the work of the committee, didn't appear as they should. And that is the first thing that needs to be corrected. I think the Taoiseach and those at Cabinet should lead by example and ensure that every Secretary General, accounting officer, should appear without fail before a committee when requested to do so. We are the ones that act as, representatives of the public. It is a democracy. People have to be held to account. Those that hold high office, even ourselves, should be held to account. And if they don't, there has to be consequences. And in this, there has been no consequences whatsoever. In fact, the obstruction has almost been condoned by the highest political office in the land down through to Cabinet level. Now, the report itself is quite bulky, a lot of reference to links and so on. And the reason for that is to allow the reader of this report to establish their own view on it. Because we came to conclusions around 14 recommendations. But I think you have to go behind those recommendations just to see how both committees and well-respected committees in the House were treated. So I believe that that is wrong. So central to the recommendations then is the reconfiguration of TLAC. I believe that that's essential, that should be done. An open and transparent process in terms of anything that happens at senior level within the civil service, and an open and transparent process in the context of the payment or expenses or whatever pension rights are there that are being offered for any position. I believe that there are those civil servants within the ranks that are disgusted by what happened, and it certainly sets a really bad example for the civil service at a time when we want to build up respect for politicians and civil servants. For this to happen and to be condoned by senior politicians is a very sad day indeed for how this House operates, and for democracy itself. On the 81,000, what disturbed me about that was there was no evidence provided as to why it should be 81,000. It seems to have been a figure plucked from somewhere to meet a particular salary level that might be palatable for some, for the public. And that is no way to conduct your business. We do not know whether or not the Secretary-General of the Department of Health is currently in receipt of the increase. We know that he didn't, he suspended acceptance of the increase until such time as the economy was better. But isn't that a strange thing that an employee of the state should be able to pick and choose when to accept or reject, or to account or not to account? We have made recommendations then, as I said, along the lines of TLAC, along the lines of the reform of the process itself. We've commented on the committees and how they should be respected and the role that they play in this House. And I would hope that the 14 recommendations would be acted on. If they're not acted on in full, I think the public then will have to make its own judgment on the lack or not of interest in transparency and accountability. Is there anyone else? Deputy Murphy.
And Chair, I concur with everything you have to say. And I think, our committees came about because of the absolute outcry from the public in relation to openness and transparency. And in that regard, I would say Mr. Watt's behaviour showed utter disregard for transparency and accountability in his dealings with both committees. And I think integrity is fundamental to the position he held then and to the position he holds now. But the disregard that was shown to the committee when we asked one particular query and received a copy of a press release as a response, I think that's the level of disregard, and which I would say the committee didn't show in return. At all times we held the view that this process was an incorrect process as opposed to a personal attack on any one individual. But so from my perspective going forward, I think what we'd seen was a total absence of openness, transparency, and a total lack of oversight. And I hope that we will never see that in the future again, and that a controversy of this nature will never arise again based on the recommendations in the report. And as you said, there could be no justification for the level of salary increase that was being purported at 81,000, I think, except you were taking your lead from the sitcom Yes Minister. So I want to thank my colleagues, and I hope that, I'd say that should this arise again, there's no doubt that we'll come together again and at all times champion openness and transparency. Thank you.
Deputy Carthy.
I want to, at the outset, commend yourself as Chair of the Finance Committee and Brian Stanley as Cahirlock of the Public Accounts Committee, and to commend this process because it is my view that government attempted to prevent the Public Accounts Committee to examine these matters by claiming that this was crossing the work of the Finance Committee. And I think both yourself and Brian Stanley did the process of accountability and transparency a great service by creating a framework in which both committees could actually work together. And I think it's a framework that worked well, and this report is a testimony to all those who are part of the process, and I commend them all. Again, just to contextualise all of this a little bit, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform is essentially the government department that is in place to protect the taxpayer, protect the public finances. The Secretary-General of that department was transferred on an interim basis to the Department of Health. At the same time, our leaders of government, the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and Minister Eamon Ryan, agreed without any evidence of a process whatsoever that the permanent post for Secretary-General of the Department of Health would secure a pay increase of €81,000. That's the increase. And when you consider that that is more than most individuals, indeed most families, earn in a given year, it is quite a phenomenal sum. And I have to say, and I was on the record of the House on a number of occasions as saying that it was my view, and I think a lot of people shared this, that the interim Secretary General would secure the permanent position, and that's what happened. And I think the very fact that this report questions the TLAC process, the independence of that process, means that that question will forever be hanging over this particular appointment, and I think that does a disservice to everybody involved. There was an opportunity through this process for those involved in the decision-making process to put their comments, and their positions and the rationale behind those positions on the public record through the deliberations of this committee, and unfortunately, none of them took up that opportunity in full. As you mentioned, there was a failure of the Taoiseach to engage constructively. There was a failure on the part of Minister Eamon Ryan to engage at all. And likewise with the new Secretary General in the Department of Health, there was a failure to engage at all. And all of this raises serious questions in terms of how public money is expended. I want to record my own party's support for the recommendations of the Finance and Public Expenditure and Public Accounts Committees in terms of what they have outlined. I have to say and put on the record that I have absolutely no confidence at all that our current leaders of government will do anything to implement its recommendations. And I say that with a heavy heart, because I think that is really disappointing, because at the place in time that we are in terms of COVID, economic development, in terms of the other challenges that our country is facing, the one assurance that the public should have is that public monies are spent with the best intentions. There will always be issues in terms of the questions, in terms of the outcomes, but the best intentions should always be there. And I think essentially behind all of this was a stroke to secure a substantial pay rise for one position of the Secretary General, which will undoubtedly and inevitably lead to further pay claims when other vacancies arise at senior levels within government. And the only way we can prevent that scenario from happening is if this report is implemented in full. And I think the record needs to be set today, and I think we can all say it in unison, that both the Public Accounts Committee and the Finance Committees will be holding government and senior civil servants to account to ensure that the resistance to the implementation of this report, if it is to transpire, will be exposed and will be highlighted. And we will do everything in our power to ensure that huge wage scales that are in place are based on a rationale and a process, and likewise with any appointments that follow through on that. So again, thanks to you, Chair, and to everybody involved in this piece of work.
Is there any other member, I'm not sure how this works in terms of teams, but is there any other member or press that wish to ask a question or clarify something? I have a hand up there from Sean before, was it?
Yeah, hiya, John. If I could just ask a question about one of the recommendations in particular on contempt of Parliament. So if someone is refusing to engage, like you've been talking about, that they could be found in contempt of Parliament, you might just explain how that would work. Like, is there a punishment for being in contempt of Parliament? And would that act, in your view, as a sort of de facto power of compatibility for committees?
Well, I think that anyone that holds a senior position, particularly accounting officers, it needs to be instilled throughout the civil service, but particularly at that level, that when a committee of the House is undertaking a report that would benefit a better process, better procedure, transparency, accountability and so on, that they should be obligated to attend, compelled maybe to attend in the context of because of the position that they hold. And that should apply to senior politicians as well. You know, when the Taoiseach was invited, he was questioned at a budget meeting. It wasn't really a specific meeting to discuss the process or lack of process. Minister Ryan, as I said, did not attend at all. But if we're going to be serious about the recommendations from committees, then we have to ensure that they're not left on a shelf and that there is a commitment to enact the recommendations. And one such recommendation in the 14 was the appointment of a senior Secretary General that would be responsible for, or if you like, act as a boss to all of the other Secretaries General, because it was confirmed for us that there is no such place within the civil service. There is no one that takes the ultimate responsibility or that can sanction a Secretary General throughout the system. So that needs to change rapidly. And to address your question, I think, you know, it would be a great improvement if we were to insist upon the attendance of Secretary Generals to the point where almost, if compellability had to be used, then fine. But I think that in the initial stages of taking up a position, should be made aware that they must attend. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. Thanks for that, John.
Paul?
Thanks, John. You mentioned that the Taoiseach didn't help you as much as you felt that the committee would have liked. Is there more that he could have done within the role, or do you see an expansion there that's needed in terms of maybe legislation that the Taoiseach would have, almost compellability powers there? Is there more that he could have done on a personal level, or I suppose was he removed from the process? Was that, I suppose, appropriate that he was removed from the process of not compelling Robert Watt to appear?
Sorry, was who removed from the process?
The Taoiseach. Is there more that he could have done in terms of, you said he didn't help as much as he could have. I'm just wondering what specifically he could have done.
Look, each one of us in this House has a responsibility to account for himself or herself. That's unquestionable. That's a given. And civil servants, particularly those at a senior level, it has to be instilled that they must attend. I know that we've mentioned compellability, but if we begin to have to compel senior civil servants to attend committees of the House that are acting in the best interests of the system and the electorate and so on in trying to achieve transparency, then we've lost the course of things altogether. So it has to be instilled from the beginning. And in the context of the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, and Minister Ryan, it was felt that they could have cooperated a whole lot more. Some of the correspondence that we received from the various players in this that were central to some of the decision making, or that we felt that should be central to the decision making, they just replied with a copy and paste from other civil servants or politicians that had already replied to us. And it took us some time to send reminders to all concerned that they should make a written submission. Some did, some didn't, and some just ignored it. I mentioned the Taoiseach because he's the leader of the government. He has the responsibility to ensure that standards are met. And in this case, they were not met. And it sent out a very negative signal, in my opinion, to the civil service, who we have all held with the greatest respect, that there should be this type of shortcut to an appointment for some, but not others. And in the context of the 80,000 for one individual, when I think politically of what we have to do to get an increase of a fiver for an old age pensioner, it doesn't go down well that these decisions are made in a quiet corner of government buildings. So I think it reflects badly on the political system that there wasn't a direct effort made to ensure that all that were concerned in this came forward and gave us a clear picture of just what went on. Because without knowing exactly what went on, how can you reform? So we have to establish the wrongs of the current process, although in this particular instance, there was very little semblance of a process to start with. And it was a bad reflection on Cabinet because they seem to act just on the nod. No Cabinet memo and so on. So it's likewise with the recent appointments, of two individuals by Eamon Ryan and indeed in the Zabone scandal. There is a process there. If it's there, well, then it should be followed. If it's not being followed, then those that are shortcutting that process, they need to be held to account. And the only people that can hold them to account are committees of this House. And if they're to be bypassed at will, well, then there's poor hope for real transparency and accountability. So I would hope that this report serves to strengthen the professionalism or the perception of that professionalism within the civil servants by people that are outside examining this. And I would also add that as you try to attract, people from the private sector into senior positions in the public sector, this makes it more difficult for them to even consider it. Because they see the system as being one of insiders and outsiders. And we have to strive in this House to ensure that that type of perception is dealt with. And it can only be dealt with by the committees of the House. I'm not sure, there's another hand up there. I can't quite make it out. JB?
Hi, John. It's Jennifer Bray here from the Irish Times. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Just two quick questions. The first one in relation to, obviously, that there are many, many shortcomings identified in the report. I think you could safely call it damning. What specifically do you think the Taoiseach needs to do now to address his own part in the shortcomings identified in this report? And secondly, on a wider basis, you talked about the need, I suppose, for consequences, and that if the various recommendations made by the committee are not addressed, that there should be consequences. What are those consequences? What does that look like for people who will be reading this report and coming away with their own conclusions?
I think that first of all we might need those that were central to the process or were involved in any way in the appointment of the interim Secretary General, and then thereafter the Secretary General in the Department of Health and TLAC and so on, that the invite should go to them from both committees in their own way, to invite them in to discuss the recommendations. It's also open to the members of either committee to invite in the political players in this for further explanation, and then to give their views on the recommendations that we have put forward. I'm not saying that this committee, the Finance Committee or the Public Accounts Committee, has all of the answers, but they certainly have a genuine desire for accountability. And the recommendations, if they're not going to be implemented, I would challenge all of them. The Minister in Deeper, the Taoiseach, Minister Ryan and the Minister for Finance, to make themselves available to both committees, to discuss the recommendations and to tell us which ones will be implemented and which ones won't. The only sanction that I can think of is, in political terms, the electorate will make up its own mind on what they see, on being uncovered before them. And then for the civil servants, well, that's a matter for, I think, a new umbrella department of a senior civil service Secretary General position that would control and administer the various Secretaries General throughout the system. And again, it is for the political system in the form of the Taoiseach and Cabinet to respond to these recommendations and tell us clearly, without any guff, what exactly they're going to implement and what they're not.
Yeah, I think obviously in the first instance, this report will be sent to various players, including the Department of Taoiseach, the Department of Public Enterprise and Reform, etc. And I think both committees will be expecting a response and the response to the recommendations. It's at that point we can see what the intent or the lack of intent would be. As I said earlier, this report is critical, but it's also constructive. We rely on the trust of the public, and that trust has been breached in this particular instance. And I would hope that that would be understood in political circles. But you know, there may well be that there's something like the Ministers and Secretaries Act requires a rebalance in terms of accountability, because essentially, and that's in relation to senior civil servants coming into various committees, a lot of the accountability for decisions taken comes through the political side, and that balance, sometimes I question whether or not that is appropriate. So there may well be a number of things, but I would see this report as a starting point, and it's a starting point that I think there would be merit in both of our committees keeping a dialogue in relation to the updates that we're each getting from the various entities and individuals that this is sent to, and then come back to it and see what progress has been made.
Paul? PH, I just see it come up on my screen here.
Paul Hosford, isn't it?
Paul Hosford, yes. You there, Paul?
He's muted.
Maybe muted, I'm not sure. Yeah, I want to agree with the Vice Chair of the Public Accounts Committee and say that the Ministers and Secretaries Act, dating back to the 1920s, I think, should certainly be revisited, and resources should be given to committees to perhaps draw up a bill that is more in keeping with the times that we now live in. I think that the press have a role to play in this, in the reporting of events such as this, or issues that are raised in the Dáil. I think the trade union movement have a role to play in this. They are the representatives, if you like, of the various civil servants at a lower scale in the organisation. I'd like to see them being proactive in terms of the type of reforms that are needed. Political parties are the same. Do they want to accept the status quo? The status quo that still exists to a degree of a nod and wink for a job, or should the political parties be fulfilling the demand of the last general election anyway, which was reform and renewal? I haven't seen much of that going on, but that has to be done as well. And the other issue was in relation to the knock-on effects of giving this increase of 81,000. And it was said that there would be no knock-on pay claims. But already a Section 42 report, which actually deals with the health services management and the increases that they're due, that have not been paid, they're now asking that they be paid. And they're being stalled by the two departments that we are reporting on, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform and the Department of Health. So already we have evidence that those within the civil and public service are coming forward to say, well, hang on, if one individual, one Secretary General position can attract an increase of 81,000 euros at a nod, well then surely the amounts that they're asking for, which is far less, should be given to them, because it should be paid, because it has already been recommended. So there will be issues in relation to this as we go along in time.
I think Matt Carty and...
Deputy Carty, do you want to come in?
No.
No?
Maybe Paul Hosford.
Jennifer Bray has spoken. Paul hasn't responded yet, unless you're there now, Paul. So that is the launch of this report completed. And the next phase will be for both committees to follow up with the various departments, officials and the political system to get the response to the recommendations that have been made. But do not underestimate the determination of the Finance Committee and the Public Accounts Committee and the members of both of those committees to pursue this in the best interest of the public that we serve and of transparency and accountability. I want to thank you all for attending. I thank everyone for their work again in relation to the production of this report. And all we can do now is hope that those that are in power will put action to their own words. Thank you very much.